So B4H is all about farming, so we need to know about some of the techniques that farmers use to increase the yield, so the amount of their crops. So first of all, we have pesticides. So farmers can add pesticides to their crops that stop things like bugs and other pests from eating their crops and make sure you get a high yield. We can also look at use of things like herbicides. So these make sure that other weeds and other plants that can interfere with the yield of your crops take up the space, take up the water. You introduce shade, which reduces the sunlight to your crops. So by removing those, then you get a better yield of your crops. The use of fertilizers is essential when we're talking about farming, especially intensive farming techniques. So we covered this a lot in the minerals topic earlier on. So if you can look back at that, and that will help you a lot. But it's the idea that we're taking these minerals out of the soil. We need to replace them so that plants can still grow and be healthy. This ties very, very closely with the intensive farming, because once intensive farming takes place, it's usually growing one type of crops, and that's taking a lot of those minerals that are specific to that particular plant or any out of the soil, and then there's none being replaced because nothing's dying and nothing's being recycled by the nitrogen cycle or carbon cycle, so we're not actually getting any of those minerals back. So by doing that, you need to add more fertilizers to the soil, otherwise the plants won't continue to grow at the same sort of rate or at all, which leads on to eutrophication, which is another issue that's brought on by fertilizers. So this is where the fertilizer will wash off and move into streams or ponds and cause growth of algae and other kind of plants in there, which will then block out the sunlight, take a lot of the oxygen out of the water, and will change the overall ecosystem of that pond and probably kill off the fish and other plants that live there. Then we have hydroponics, which is when we grow plants just in water with a mineral solution in there, a nutrient solution in there, so that they can grow without soil. This helps to grow plants in places where you wouldn't normally be able to do it, control the growth very specifically, and you can grow things in greenhouses without having to take up a lot of space. Also, when we think about the efficiency of farming, we think about things like keeping animals in smaller areas. So when we look at chickens, which are kept in chicken pens, which stops them from running around so that they don't waste as much energy, and when they lay eggs it's more convenient. Other animals like pigs and cows, and that stops them from wasting the energy and the food that you provide by keeping them in a smaller area so that more of the food is used for growth. And then finally, we need to think about biological control. So biological control is where you introduce some other organism to try and control something like a pest, for example, there. So you could, for example, add something like cane toads, which we look at in one of the examples, which will then reduce the population of other insects or other organisms, and therefore will make things better for farmers. But sometimes biological controls have sort of a history of not being very predictable, so you don't know what the knock-on effects of that would be. When we look at pesticides as well, also need to think about these getting out of control, which is something like DDT, which then affects the later other organisms further up the food chain, as the DDT or the pesticides in whatever example start to accumulate in their tissues. This then leads to organisms higher up the food chain from dying off.